In this inaugural episode of Q Culture, we commemorate World AIDS Day 2022, looking back at the rich career of Keith Weinstein, recipient of the National Diversity Award for Positive Role Model. Now approaching his sixth decade, his drive and ambition is even more unstoppable, maintaining his quest as a powerful force for good in the queer community and beyond.
It seems to me that politicians or those who want an easy target will tend to pick on marginalised people, will tend to pick on gay communities. We're seeing it today around the trans community, the right-wing press, the prejudice, the hatred. And for what? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. People should be able to live their own lives. And you know, people should just mind their own business about what people do. Either with their gender or with their sexuality. It's got absolutely nothing to do with anybody else.
Thank you. Good evening, I'm David Bowie. Your Royal Highness, ladies, and young dudes, welcome to the very first Concert for Hope. Like myself, I'm sure that many of you this evening have friends who are either affected by HIV, or have AIDS, or have died from AIDS. Until a cure is found for this most terrible of diseases, it is our duty to make life more bearable for them. And this very special event, has been put together on behalf of the National AIDS Trust, and Crusade, and their fight against this disease.
Tell me about some of your memories.
Well, thank you for reminding me that it was such a long time ago. Probably one of the highlights of my career. I'd never experienced, anything like that before. I'm a Yorkshireman. I'm from inner city Leeds. To be mixing with royalty and celebrity for such an important issue, such as HIV and AIDS. Because, we've got to remember back then in the 90s, there was so much stigma, discrimination, prejudice. Sadly, today, the stigma and prejudice still exists, and that makes me really, really unhappy. But the role that Diana, Princess of Wales, played was that she, and it's famous, it's been documented, we've seen it, so many times, but I can't emphasize just how important it was for her to be a huge supporter of people living with HIV and AIDS. Because there was no cure, there was no vaccine, there was no medical treatments for people with HIV at the time. If they developed AIDS, they died, and I lost lots of people during the 90s. But the spotlight that Diana brought on the issue was immeasurable. I mean, it was worth millions of pounds to us as far as the attention they brought to the subject, not just in the UK, but right across the world, and the impact was tremendous. Being involved in the Concert of Hope, though, was absolutely central for us attracting other artists, attracting the world's media to come along, and also to sell tickets as well. And that concert was not only raised money for National AIDS Trust and Crusade, but also the profile and awareness of HIV, because, of course, it was broadcast. The first one was broadcast actually on BBC at Christmas that year, which was tremendous. And the Take That concert was broadcast, I think it was Channel 4, but certainly, we had mainstream media on Christmas Day, AIDS on Christmas Day in 93, 94. That was quite an achievement.
Really quite. At a time when there were the famous iceberg commercial and the media was giving HIV/AIDS a really, really bad time.
Yeah, you've got to remember, certainly the tabloid press, some of the hatred, and it was hatred, homo hatred, I think, that's how I sort of see it. It was awful. I was born in the 60s, sort of grew up in the 70s, really thought I was the only gay in the village, thought I was the only one. And so all of that impact of stigma, not just about HIV and AIDS, but just being gay. I mean, the only things you saw on television were plays where homosexuals committed suicide or homosexuals, died a lonely death. I mean, when I came out to my parents in 1984, the first thing my mom said to me was that, oh, you're going to die young and on your own. And, almost 40 years later, I'm still here, living healthily. I've had, good relationships with men of, with partners of the same sex, happy sort of relationships, and also, have survived. I think one of the key issues for me as a 60-year-old is just sort of dealing with some of the, survivor guilt, I suppose. And also I still grieve and miss many people who died who I knew back in the sort of 80s and 90s. And that still impacts on my well-being today.
I think it's a difficult time because it was very close to the whole Clause 28 thing. Wasn't it? And it didn't make it very easy because, first of all, being gay was put into question in terms of society and the norms that, were expected.
When I talk to young people about my experiences, I'll give you an example. And it's really interesting that we're in Chelsea because it's where I got my mortgage, my first mortgage in the King's Road, the Abbey National. I don't know if it's still there, probably not. But it was back in the mid-90s. And to get a mortgage, you were asked a question, have you ever tested for HIV? Now, my partner at the time had tested for HIV, was HIV negative. I was working on campaigns to encourage people, if they thought they'd put themselves at risk of HIV, to be tested. It was the sensible thing to do. Yet the mortgage brokers, they wanted to know, had you tested for any sexual transmitted infection? And if you ticked yes, you were immediately refused a mortgage. Now, when it came to me applying for the mortgage, we applied for the mortgage in my name because I could honestly say, because I hadn't had an HIV test. I didn't think I was at risk of having an HIV test. So I signed all the papers, told the truth, was given the mortgage. But of course, my partner and I, we bought a house, and we bought a house in Brighton, and we lived in Brighton for a number of years, and him paying half of the mortgage and all that kind of stuff. I'm glad to say that my work at the National AIDS Trust, actually, we campaigned for mortgage brokers not to be able to, mortgage lenders rather, not to be able to ask that question. They could legitimately ask if somebody had tested positive at that time because of the insurance premiums, all of those sorts of things. But at National AIDS Trust, we saw that as a huge barrier. If people were too terrified to go and have a test, which is the most sensible thing to do if you think you're at risk of HIV or any illness, to get yourself tested to seek medical advice. But that's the level of stigma and discrimination. And going back to sort of Clause 28, I mean, that was in place by Margaret Thatcher and the Tory government, and it was revoked by Tony Blair's government after 1997. Nobody was ever prosecuted under Clause 28, but the damage, the fear, and the prejudice that clause evoked, I will never forgive the Tories for that, because it was pure hatred. And it seems to me that politicians or those who want an easy target will tend to pick on marginalised people, will tend to pick on gay communities. We're seeing it today around the trans community, the right-wing press, the prejudice, the hatred. And for what? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. People should be able to live their own lives. And people should just mind their own business about what people do, either with their gender or with their sexuality. It's got absolutely nothing to do with anybody else. And that's why we all, as an LGBT and T community, have to stand together. Because if we don't, they'll start picking on you, they'll start picking on me, they'll start picking on other people, because we're easy targets. And that's why we have to sort of support our brothers and sisters in the fight against prejudice, always.
Well, we've come a long way since the 90s and the doom and gloom around HIV/AIDS. It's now sort of World AIDS Day, 2022. Corey, if you were like, if you met someone and they told you that they're HIV positive, how would you react? And if you say you were attracted to them, mm-hmm. and then you found out,
I certainly, I grew up during it, but when we were growing up, it wasn't really connected, I think, to homosexuality even when we were learning about it. To me, the idea of getting AIDS just through needle sharing was as prominent as sexual transmission. So I always saw it as something that could happen to anybody. I think our education was very kind of positive in that way, that it wasn't just a gay thing. But finding out like a potential partner had it would definitely still bring a bit of a stigma, more of a pity stigma than a fear stigma. You feel bad for them. You think like, oh, that's it. Now obviously it's not the death sentence that it was in the late 90s or early 2000s, but there's still, especially in America where healthcare isn't socialized, the idea of having to pay for treatment for the rest of your life would still be a terrifying prospect.
But you're aware this PrEP and PEP and people who are HIV positive, the treatment, they're able to get their viral load down, so it's completely undetectable, that they're able to have unprotected sex, and there is absolutely no risk to the other partner.
You know that, but there's still like, it's just that little thing in the back of your head. It's just like that, and maybe for people younger than me, it's that's just completely gone. But growing up when it was still that kind of death sentence almost still has that. It's just there in the back of your head. I don't know.
So would you still want to know this person, even if it was a platonic relationship?
Oh, absolutely, a platonic.
Would you want to explore it becoming more intimate?
I don't know. It's something that I haven't encountered. I think it's just the fact that it's significantly less common. I think in my generation, it's not something that I've run into, and I was never really big in the hookup scene growing up. It was, I didn't go to gay clubs. I think coming up with the internet, everything was just personal, like Yahoo Personals and OkCupid, and that's where I met potential partners, and it was always meant to be more of a long-term relationship. So I never got into the more promiscuous gay culture lifestyle.
It's one of a kind, wouldn't you say, Keith? There?
Well, yeah. I mean, a couple of thoughts. For me, I mean, knowing somebody's status, I think I would find helpful. It wouldn't put me off if I have slept with people who are HIV positive, like a long time ago, who I knew to be HIV positive, but also made choices about the kind of sex that we're going to have. Always make sure, because condoms still. Today, of course, there are sort of medications, PrEP, that any sort of man or woman that wants to have unprotected sex can take, which will protect you from getting HIV. I've experienced myself, a number of years ago where, I did something which I thought I'd put myself at risk. And as soon as I got back to Britain, I went to Dean Street and saw a doctor, had some tests, went on a month of PEP, which was post-exposure prophylaxis, tested after a month, negative, tested after 3 months, negative, tested after 6 months, negative. So I was fine. Now, I may not have had HIV or been at risk, but I had unprotected sex. So the sensible thing for me to do was to have PEP at the time. I'm not in a relationship at the moment, but if I was and I wanted to have unprotected sex, then I would, as a lot of my younger male friends have, gone to health clinic, Dean Street, got PrEP so that they can have unprotected sex. So, without the fear of contracting HIV. So I think the medical advances that have happened, in the last 10 years or so. I mean, when I first heard of PrEP, I heard it from a photographer at a gay pride event I was at, and he was talking about buying drugs online. It's like, whoa, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You shouldn't be buying drugs on the internet, all this kind of stuff. But I then went away and did some research, and then it's like, oh, hold on a second. So there are new medications.
Antiretrovirals, not like drugs.
No. It was a form of PrEP, but I didn't know what he was talking about. You see, this was the thing. This was science has moved so quickly over. I stopped working in HIV in 2005. Not that I lost interest, but it wasn't my day job. I wasn't working on it day to day. Also, I was in a long-term relationship, so the idea of having to protect myself, that was something that didn't need to be considered. since, my partner and I broke up in 2008, of course, I've been living as a single man. And certainly, I haven't, apart from the time when I went to Berlin and went just a little wild with a couple of young friends. But you know what? It was really weird because there was a shame attached to that. How could I have been banging on for decades about safer sex and then do something as foolish as having unprotected sex with somebody?
Human
and you know
nature.
what? I'm a human being. We all can get it wrong. But I learned from that experience, and I think that's really, really important. And I think, I do want to drum home this message that if somebody is on medication to treat their HIV and their viral load is undetectable, it is impossible to contract HIV from that person. I think we have to work really hard at getting that message out so that, people understand that you won't get HIV. You might get something else, though, like, the syphilis, gonorrhea, all sorts of other sexually transmitted infections. And, we all, as adults, have to be responsible for our sexual health, not just for ourselves, but for the partners that we're having sex with. So, there are responsibilities, but, we need to take those, as adults, take those responsibilities. And also, I feel so strongly about educating young people about, what I call still safer sex practices or better sex practices, because, we still have teenage pregnancies. We still get young people being diagnosed with all sorts of sexual health problems. And there's still a lot of ignorance around how HIV is transmitted, how other sexual infections are transmitted as well. And I think education is the key. There is no bliss in ignorance. None. And I think it's really important that we, all of us, educate each other and especially our children, young people coming up, because, information and knowledge is so important to living a healthy life, both physically and mentally. And the only way we can do that is by talking about these issues openly and with authenticity.
Keith Weinstein, it's been an absolute honor to have you on our inaugural episode of Q Culture. Thank you so much, and we'll speak to you when you get a BAFTA, I guess.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks.